Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first live stream from Theresa. I would love it if someone from YouTube could send a message and say, hey, yeah, we see you. Because we don't see you. I hope everything is going okay. Okay, I'm just going to imagine that it's going okay. Okay, yeah. So it's easier. My name is Chris Speaks. I'm American, but I live in Brazil. I currently am doing my doctorate at PUC University in São Paulo. And I am very glad to welcome today 3 guests. We have Mary Jane Curry. She's from Rochester, New York, and is one of the editors of this. Oh, someone can see us. Very good.
Nice.
Of this book, which we're gonna talk a little bit more about. We have Theresa Lillis. Is that right, Lillis?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
From the UK, currently in Spain, and we also have Maria Fernanda Monteiro, who is Brazilian, studied with me, also at the Catholic University in São Paulo, and we do some research together on this topic. All right. So before I get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Tellus International Library. Tellus Editora has created a project where academic books that are of interest to Brazilian researchers are published in Brazil in conjunction with the original publisher, and are made available to us here in Brazil at Brazilian prices instead of at import prices. So for us, particularly with the dollar crazy the way it is right now, it's really fantastic to be able to get an academic book for 100 reais instead of 500 or 600 reais. At the moment, all of our titles are centered around the education and language teaching and bilingualism area. And one of the first ones that we brought in this collection was Global Academic Publishing. Okay, the camera, where's the camera? There we go. Global Academic Publishing. Okay. Which is the book we're going to talk about today, and the research we're going to talk about today is this idea of how our academic work gets published, who reads it, why is it published, what is done with that publication, and topics along those lines. Okay. Before we get started with questions, Dr. Curry, would you like to say a few words?
Well, sure. What academic doesn't like to say a few words? I'm very happy to be here and really honored to be invited to do this. I don't even know what you call this, webcast.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. And to talk about this book, which came out almost 2.5 years ago. So, you know, in academic time, that's like a lifetime ago. But it comes out of work that Theresa and I have been doing together since 2001, basically, so a long time. So it's something that is still really of interest to me and quite important. And, you know, we can talk more about, I know you're interested in how we got started, but just kind of by chance, I guess we would love to claim responsibility for knowing that this topic was going to become so globally hot in terms of the pressure on scholars to publish in English. And I think that's kind of how we got interested in it, but we really couldn't have predicted how intense that pressure was going to get around the world and what some of the effects were going to be. So it's always just personally really gratifying to me to know that scholars around the world are interested in our work, both for what it represents academically and intellectually, but also because a lot of scholars have told us how much they really feel that it connects with their personal experiences. And I think for academic work, that's not always true. A lot of times people work on things that are kind of removed from reality. And so for good or bad, this is something that seems like it really does touch people. And so it's, I guess it's been an unexpected bonus of working on this topic for me.
Great. And Dr. Lillis, would you like to say a few words before we get started?
Yeah, well, as Mary Jane says, we've been working on this topic now for many years. Feels like forever, but it's, you know, it's 20 years, but it still feels as if there's lots and lots of work that needs to be done, you know, by us in terms of thinking, but also plenty of work to be done by scholars around the world on particular issues relating to publishing. Yeah, and as MJ said, we started off quite small, you know, doing some case studies, and then the project grew as we came to understand more about the issues and tried to engage with what seemed to be important for different people, different scholars we were working with.
Great, thank you. Maria Fernanda, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I would like to say that I'm very happy that we're doing this. It's an honor to meet the two professors, and the subject is something very real for us. Like Chris and I, we are starting an academic career, so we have this question with publishing. We have to put ourselves out there. So we started. It all started like this, with us questioning about our own research and how we're gonna put that on the map. And the book you two organized is, like you said, it talks to us.
For sure, for sure. You know, I was just thinking before I get into our questions, how thrilled I am that we are having this discussion about a topic that is so pertinent and so personal and so real. And we are not talking about how to do X, Y, or Z during the pandemic. It seems like everything recently is, you know, whatever, domestic violence in the pandemic, kids in the pandemic, and teaching online in the pandemic. And I'm really thrilled that this discussion has nothing to do.
Maybe we can find a connection by the end.
You know, I'm sure we can.
We can.
Certainly. I mean, one of the things that I've read is how women are producing less during the pandemic.
That's
That's what I was going to say.
A new drop. You know, so okay. So the first thing that we kind of wanted to talk about, it's a little bit. It's something that we only know about here in Brazil, and we don't really know what the rest of the world is like, and that is self-publishing. And the kind of the phenomena of, you know, putting your money on the table and taking a book away from a publisher, and getting your work out in that way. This is a really, really common practice in Brazil. Really common practice. And it's not particularly seen as a problem. It's the way to get your work out there. It was weird for me when I first started to have an academic career in Brazil. It's like, wait, people are paying to have their own books published? Wait.
No, Chris, are you talking specifically about books or also about this kind of predatory journal publishing phenomenon?
You know, I'm talking specifically about books. I think that I know what you're talking about, this predatory journal phenomena. I don't think has got a foothold into Brazil yet.
Interesting.
I think. But the idea, so and the predatory publishing even of books, I do think, although it is a common habit, I do think that some of it is predatory. I mean, I haven't defended yet, so I don't know. But Maria Fernanda, you've probably received dozens of emails offering publishing opportunities, right?
Yeah. I've received a few, but most of it, when you Google it, you found out that it's not worth it. It's like a a scam.
Mm-hmm.
So they take your work, your research, and then they don't do the book as they said they would do, or they don't do enough, they don't sell.
But on the other hand, there are plenty of publishers that are high quality, good publishers that they have editorial processes, etc., but they just don't front the money. You front the money.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of how that is, that's a book. When you put it in your CV, it's a book. There's no line that says I paid for it myself. It's a book. It has an ISBN. It's a book. It's a chapter. It's a chapter. And we were wondering a little bit about how that reality that we live here may or may not be different in other places. Do you all have any?
Theresa, do you want to say something to that?
It's not something that we've researched directly. So it's not a phenomenon that was coming out of, the context we were researching in. And it's not something, so in the edited collection, that's not a particular issue that's coming out. But I think it's a really interesting one for all sorts of reasons. So it's definitely something that there should be some work done on, and to evaluate, analyze, well, what does it mean in terms of, say, knowledge production globally? Because it can be, it could be quite a radical, contrast, couldn't it? The idea of people making sure their work gets out there in a highly competitive context. It could be viewed as quite a progressive or radical, opportunity. It's not something we've researched. And it's not something that we've come across that much, but I do think it happens in certain fields than others. I don't know if you're talking about education, are you?
We are, but I think it's pretty standard in Brazil.
Okay. Across this. Okay.
At least in the humanities.
Yeah, for sure in the humanities.
Okay. I was going to ask about the disciplines, because I think different disciplines, as you know, prioritize book publications over journal publications. So, I mean, our book does have a couple of chapters on the predatory journal publications, and how, what those look like, and also the confusion that there can be between open access and predatory, because that can be kind of blended. A lot of people think of those, or used to think of them anyhow, as the same thing. I mean, I would suggest that any market for scholars to pay for publication, in addition to possible kind of radical reactions to the dominance of really traditional publishing houses, also has a lot to do with the pressures that people are under. And so it may be that those pressures come out more in predatory journals in certain fields, and in book what we call, or what used to be called in the old days, vanity presses, which is basically, we'll take your money. People used to do this in the States with like family genealogies. They'd print 400 copies for their closest friends and stuff. But I'm sure that I could see that it could have a similar kind of market in the academics. But I think some of that also gets to some of the questions you emailed us about in terms of how scholars are evaluated. So if those presses are known to be what we would call vanity presses, then in some contexts they would just immediately be discounted. But if it's a line on your CV and that counts, then that raises these interesting questions that Theresa's posing about, and the other question is also, who reads these books? So if it's just getting published so that you have a line on your CV, then is that even where any scholar wants their work to end up? Or do those publishers have a distribution network? Do they actually get books out to people? Do they get them in bookstores or Amazon or, whatever it could be a whole alternative mechanism. But I think there's so many parts of that knowledge economy in terms of producing the text that are really contingent depending on the context.
Yeah, it's I think all of those possibilities are happening in Brazil. I think there is something radical in some ways about this process, particularly I think what we did. I maybe not so much about because what we did was we gathered a group of people from our program who were kind of, our friends, the ones we thought were the most interesting and that we thought would be the most reliable and whatever. And we gathered together and we said, hey, we want to write a book. Let's write a book.
Yeah.
And we all kind of looked at each other and said, a book about what? Because we all had really different areas of research, really, really different areas of research. And we didn't want to just make a Frankenstein where everyone wrote an article kind of summarizing their research and we Frankensteined this book together. We wanted it to be a book that had some kind of, coherent theme. And we talked and we talked and we talked. And we finally settled on methodology. And we finally settled on talking about how hard it was as a young scholar to go through our methodological processes. Which methodology would we use? How did we choose? What happened when we went to the field? Did it work? Did it fail? Those kinds of questions. And so now we have a volume that is how many? 8 chapters?
9
chapters. So we have 9 different viewpoints about these methodological questions in research and education. And we see it, the 9 of us, as being quite radical because there was no professor involved, basically. My advisor was sort of like an ad hoc advisor, but really just over beer.
He indicated some publishers, no?
He did help us find the publisher. Yeah, he helped us to find a publisher that he thought was doing good work. But basically it was us. We did it. We wanted to do it and we did it. And the publisher has a fair amount of distribution. And anytime we said, hey, we want to do an event, they would come and they would bring more books. They would, bring posters and all of that kind of stuff. And so we had several events. I don't think we sold that many books, but it got out there pretty well. But that question you said at the very end, Dr. Curry, about, well, if I just pay for it and it's published and I have a box in my garage with 400 books in it, is that the scholarship that I want to be doing?
Right.
And we were all very determined that that was not the scholarship that we wanted to be doing, but we didn't know how to do anything else. Which kind of leads us to then the question that Fernanda's going to ask.
Because of this book that we 9 organized, then we started to discuss, and nothing really serious, about how we were unprepared for to put our research in the world. Because like Chris said, we were talking and we wanted to publish this book and write something and show to everyone else what we were doing. But we didn't know how to do it. Not only steps that we should do to make a book, but is it better to write an article? Is it better to publish a book or to do like a conference? And we opted for the book because we could put the 9 research together, and we found this theme that connected us all. But it got us thinking about how unprepared we were. And last year, Chris and I wrote a paper about that, about how the formation for publishing is something that we don't discuss. And we would like it if you two could talk about that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So you in different parts of the world, postgraduate students are required or not required to secure publications as part of securing their PhD. I don't know what the case is in Brazil or in particular fields, but certainly, say, for example, in the UK, you do not have to get a publication in order to be awarded a PhD. So that's one thing. Obviously, somebody who's in a situation where there are situations where you have to have 2 publications before you've completed your PhD. So there's different formal models going on, aren't there? But there also seem to me to be different kind of informal or models going on as well. So for me personally, it's quite surprising that if you are a PhD student and are still developing your theory and your methodology and you're working on your data collection, that you would see publishing as your main goal. That's still surprising, but that's because of my own, my own training and doing a PhD. It would never occurred to me that I would publish, and I wasn't required to do that. So I don't know I don't know whether you're saying you are required to publish, and how do you go about that? Or are you saying actually you think it's important and it's something that you want to do, to publish whilst you're still doing your PhD? Or I'm not quite sure the context we're talking about.
Makes sense. Go ahead.
Well, here for us, it's not a requirement during the process. It's nice if you do it.
Yeah,
exactly. You're not obligated.
Yeah.
But since the beginning, when we enter the masters, the professors are saying, you have to publish. You have to put yourselves out there and everything. So it's not an obligation, but
it almost is. Yeah. Yes.
And very much like you're choosing this academic life. Academics do this.
Yeah.
Very much in that way, And then the second part of the requirement has more to do with how we get jobs afterwards.
Right.
Yes.
When I did my master's in the States, my first master's, I was on a search committee at the University of Arizona, and I got to go through that process, which every graduate student should have that opportunity. But anyway, and I learned a lot about how all of that went. And in Brazil, it is very, very different. In Brazil, it's all about points. Not necessarily points that are aligned on your CV. There are several different ways that the points are accumulated. It is a public test. And how well you score on the teaching part, how well you score on they call it the titles test. So your titles are your degrees, but also other things, right? And quite often there's an actual test. There's actual things to read and some writing to be done. So at that moment, your publications have become very important.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you've gone through 6 years of a master's in a doctoral program and you haven't published anything, then you are just not competitive in the job market.
I think that's actually quite that's becoming increasingly common in the United States, that we don't have any requirements to publish. In the sciences, of course, they've had a much longer model of, participation in a research laboratory and getting involved in publishing early, sometimes even as an undergraduate, and having your name on a paper and contributing in some way to a paper. And, it's much more of a group dynamic and a collaborative effort. And, in our interdisciplinary fields of education and language studies and writing studies, it varies tremendously.
Yeah.
And I think that, I had some publications, but I never co-authored with my advisor. And so I actually, I learned a lot because Theresa was my office mate when I got hired out of my PhD. I learned a lot from Theresa. I learned a lot from other colleagues. But I think, another point is that particularly in education, there's a lot of people who do doctorates in education who are not going to become academics. So the field, it's not quite as focused on one outcome as some other academic fields. And I think even like in the humanities, they're realizing they can't just be focused on academics anymore because the jobs don't exist. So I think there's a lot of push and pull about publishing. I think it's very common for doctoral students to feel that they have not been given enough training or information or experience with publishing. And, you know, some places are now offering specific courses, classes in how to write for publication. I mean, I've been developing some at my university, but, you know, even there, I think that's not the same thing as actually collaborating with someone who is going to really dedicate time to bringing you onto a project or supporting you in your own project. And of course, there's all kinds of horror stories about people who do collaborate and then the faculty member steals their idea. You know, there's all kinds of bad stories too, but we don't need to dwell on that. But I mean, there's a lot of books and articles on how to get published. What we've seen, and in fact, we've written one, but what we saw when we were doing some of the kind of literature search and looking at what was out there, is that a lot of those books are not based on research. They're based on people's own experience. And so you get into this weird space where they say, well, I did it, and therefore here's what I did, and therefore it will work for you. And they often recognize a lot of the contextual factors, or that they had some other kind of access that they weren't acknowledging. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So I do think it's very common, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's harder for scholars who are using English as an additional language and scholars who are working in countries outside of the Anglophone center. You know, these are the kinds of debates that we've engaged with quite a bit. I think everybody would agree that writing for publication is hard work, and no matter what your language background is, no matter where you're situated. And I think most people would probably say that we felt underprepared or unprepared to do it. And then within that general frame, a lot of people have had a lot of different experiences and a lot of different types of access or lack of access.
And when we presented the paper that we wrote in October, there were two reactions, straight divide, just like that. All the graduate students in the audience were like, and all of the professors in the audience were like, what you talking about, Willis? It was night and day. Because what we were saying was, we feel really prepared to do research. I am ready. I can go into the field. I can ask the questions. I can work on getting out bias. I can do all those things. I am ready to teach a university level class. I can think about this that we do, because in education, we're talking a lot about educating educators, right? So I'm ready. I can go. I can talk to these pedagogical students, whatever. How do I get from this enormous thesis that I have written into these pages, and not in a technical writing sense, but in a get my research out into the world in such a way that people want to read it, and who wants to read it? That's where we just feel so lost. So we're glad that we're alone. Our next question is actually what you were hitting on just now, Dr. Curry, and that's the language piece. And the dominance of English, some of the issues that you touched on, particularly in the first chapter and that introduces the book. For us here in our part, it's not in our program, but in this kind of very critical humanities part of academia in Brazil, publishing in English almost feels like a betrayal of particular values, so to speak. And so there certainly isn't a push for it, but that ends up meaning that there's not a push for getting your work into widely circulating journals about your topic, because maybe your topic doesn't circulate so widely in this small academic area that is Brazil. So that's kind of our experience. It's not a question for me, but I can tell you that I feel more comfortable submitting an article to a Brazilian journal in my second language, which is Portuguese, than I do submitting an article in English to a journal from the UK or North America. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's it's true. So anyway, I would just like to talk a little bit about this piece, about the language piece and this kind of cultural hegemony piece that may be going on. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that you touch on there is the question of which disciplines are you talking about? And, you know, when we started doing our research, it was pretty well established that scientific fields were moving in the direction of English, and there were examples of, I remember a German chemistry journal that had changed its language and its name, you know, from German to English, and this was in the late 90s. And we've seen that increasingly happen, that not necessarily that the journals are disappearing in local languages, but that scholars are really being pressured either implicitly or explicitly to publish in English. And a lot of scholars want to, as you say, find the widest possible audience for their work. So it's completely understandable on that sense. But there are all of these policies that are also pushing them to it. And I'm not sure if you're asking about, you know, there's a kind of large debate going on in our field about whether multilingual scholars are at a disadvantage or not. And certainly many of the participants in our study and other research would suggest that inevitably they have some disadvantage, if only in the sense of how much more time it might take to write in English or feeling as comfortable,
right,
etc. But that's not everyone. There are certain people in our study who absolutely felt very comfortable writing in English and were very successful. And what we've also really looked at is how important is English itself for getting published. And there's a kind of fetishization of the language, whereas what we've been looking at is really the larger practices going on. And we had scholars in our study whose English language proficiency, if they had to take a test, might be among the lowest, and yet they were publishing some, you know, more frequently than other people. So I mean, there's a lot of different issues cutting through, and so I don't think I'm giving you a specific answer, but I'm sure Theresa can add on here.
I'm afraid the quality was quite poor for me there, so I could only hear bits of what MJ was saying. I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're okay. There was some interference, but
okay. So I'm not sure. I heard bits of what MJ was saying there. Yeah. Yeah, it's, I suppose, with the language issue, English, I guess what we kind of argue is that, yes, there is a language issue, but things are never only about language. Right. So when you're talking about entering conversations and, you know, I feel comfortable writing for a journal based in Brazil, but perhaps not so comfortable writing for a journal based elsewhere. I suppose what, you know, it'd be interesting to hear what what your thoughts are about that. But of course, what we've seen is that it's about well, the obvious things are about to do. Well, is what I'm focusing on of interest to people who view this topic, the world, in a particular way or not? So there's the kind of the topic thing. But then there's also that sense of identity about who do I think I am when I'm writing this, and who am I imagining I'm writing to and for, and that's very complicated generally, I think. And it's complicated when if you compare, you know, say a UK monolingual scholar, well, there's never any debate about which language or probably which target in a way. But once you're a scholar who's moving through several languages, then there are many more questions that come into play that are not straightforward. I guess, you know, the things that have been interesting to me are about how do people, it's like what's the cultural resource of move, rather than thinking, am I writing in English, am I writing in Portuguese, am I writing in Spanish, when am I doing what, is what does moving through these different languages do for me in terms of my intellectual work? What kind of resources is it bringing to my work? But of course, those conversations, you don't normally have in, you know, standard journal articles, we'll say. It's quite hard to get those kinds of issues visible. So, I mean, I don't know, you're raising all sorts of questions. You're raising like practical questions, it seems to be. And when Maria said before about, you know, we feel that we don't really know what the rules of the game are, really, you know, but as MJ says, most people feel like that when you're working through doing. And also, I mean, certainly when I think of the UK, all this stuff that we've been focusing on, what constitutes a particular kind of capital that's measured in a particular way that is then used to.
Oh no. We're cutting out.
Focusing on our particular piece of work.
Oh, Theresa, you cut out a little
So
bit.
I think, yeah, I can feel I'm going in and out. So I'll stop.
Well, I
let somebody pick up any thread.
This question about community, about you know, which community of scholars is it that I am involved in or that I want to be involved in? I think that this is a really interesting point, and it's not something that we, as young scholars, as early career scholars, I think that that's difficult for us, because what we want is we want to have that academic life. You know, we want that dreaming of this, you know, the PhD and the career, and for me, very specifically, getting out of applied linguistics was really important, because I really needed to come to terms with the fact that that was not the community of scholars that I wanted to be in. Not that it was bad or that I didn't like it, but particularly in Brazil.
One of our early, actually our first article from our study, which came out in 2004, we actually kind of mapped out a whole range of communities that the scholars in our study were contributing to, including applied audiences, which again is often very important for people working in fields of education or any kind of practice-oriented fields where people feel like they want to be able to do scholarship, but they also want to be able to influence local practice or practice more broadly. And so, I mean, even for people working in one context with one language, we often have, dual goals of doing both kind of more traditional abstract scholarship and more applied scholarship. But I think, you know, as we mapped out those different communities, I think there were 7 of them that scholars in our study were engaged in. It really illustrated the complexity, as Theresa's saying, of these choices that people make. And people tend to make them related to specific papers or projects that they're working on. And, you know, in the US, where we still have tenure, what some of us still work in institutions that have to give tenure. You know, one thing a lot of people will do, like in my field of education and applied linguistics, is kind of focus on the more traditional scholarship before tenure, and then after tenure, when you're more secure in your work situation, allow yourself more to engage in scholarship that might reach applied audiences or might reach the public. And so, you know, your commitments may be there all along. You may have multiple commitments in that regard all along, but you may feel more empowered to enact some of those commitments at different moments in your career. And I think that's really based on context and also what kind of a job you have. Because if you're in a job that's pressuring, you know, a research-focused job, it may not be as valued to do publications that are aimed to really work with people in real context as opposed to academic journals. So I think there's a lot of complexity to choices that people make, even from the beginning. I mean, some of the doctoral students that I teach who are working full-time in the schools, they're not going to become academics. They may want to publish, but they're not interested in publishing in applied linguistics journals or TESOL journals. They're interested in publishing in teacher publications or administrative publications. And I actually think, having worked with them for quite a while now, that that's an area of publishing that's so heavily undervalued by the traditional research publishing apparatus all around the world, that, you know, that's how the research gets, you know, reformulated and redeployed for people who can actually use it and can actually give feedback to the researchers. And that's been undervalued for a long time, you know.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel as if we're not getting to talk about what you really want to talk about. You know, we're talking about.
We're going right down the list.
Okay, yeah. Fine. As long as we are. Okay, fine.
We're really good. No, really good. Really good.
But one thing I wanted to ask you then, you said in your email, I mean, we've talked about, you know, people feeling underprepared, and as MJ said, what we did write a book to try and draw on our research to basically share the rules of the game, not to tell people they should do this, they shouldn't do that, but we tried to say, for example, the communities, to say, look, if you're a scholar in the world today, and if you're working across multiple languages or multiple contexts, you are in a complex situation. For example, you know, you may want to think, do you want to write for this community, for that community? What's your priority? Is your priority this community for this year, that other community for the next 3 years? Because the other thing is, as we've said, writing is hard work. It's time consuming. So we all kind of have to make difficult choices. So we did try and set out what I guess we'd come to learn as the rules of the game through what we'd learned about what the different scholars were doing. Yeah. But that feels to me as if that's one of the issues you're raising about, well, what should be shared and how should it be shared about what the rules of the game are, so that then we can make active choices and participate. But the other thing, I'm seeing your email, you talked about sort of joining publishing as an act of resistance.
That's very much our thing.
Yeah. So you know, so I'd like to hear about that, because that it feels to me as if there's a whole area there, or a thesis, or you know, a set of ideas that you're working with about how you want to engage. So I'd be interested to hear, why do you frame it as resistance? Anything at all about, you know, what this means to you, I think.
Yep.
You want to start?
No, you can go.
No, I think when we said that the first time, we were talking about the book.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. About the book. But I think the idea grew as we were really working with it, partially because of the kind of scholarship that we're doing. I mean, I'm taking on neoliberalism in education. That's an act of resistance. In and of itself, that's an act of resistance. But we said it originally about the book because we said it shortly after finishing and taking a look at what we had done and listening to our professors. And the one of our professors, who has been the department head, is not currently, said to a whole group of people that we did something that no one had ever done in the program, which was a group of students getting together, creating an edited volume, putting it out into the world. Yeah. Not on our own. Not being students who were invited to participate in, but just completely student or formal. We were about half and half. Some people had already defended and some people hadn't. I was the baby in terms of academics because I was in my master's and everyone else was in their doctorate or finishing. That's my second master's. Anyway, but he's saying this to this group of people, and then after, you know, we were talking about it, and we studied Giraud a lot, in our program. Our program is not particularly practical. It's the history, politics, philosophy, and sociology of education.
Okay.
so we're kind of talking, and we're kind of really realized that saying no, we're not going to not publish because we don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we are not going to make a Frankenstein because it's all we can think of.
Mm-hmm.
No, we're not going to publish something that no one cares about reading just so we can have a line on our CV. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to do something. Go ahead.
No, the question that we raised after that we finished the book is that we didn't want to do something just for doing it. We didn't want to
make it. Yeah.
We didn't want it to do some to bend to the rules, the rules of the game. So we wanted to put ourselves out there, but in a way that was meaningful.
Yes.
And you know, with all the different little pieces we've talked about today, we've talked about various situations and various moments in which writing is happening, or publishing is happening, or studying is happening, or language choice is happening because of something that's outside of our own scholarship.
Okay.
And we wanted to make those choices for ourselves. I mean, we literally sat in a circle on my living room floor and said to each other, we want to make these choices for ourselves. And that felt really radical when we were doing it. And it felt radical when we were done with it. And every time I hold that book and give a copy to somebody, or suggest a chapter to somebody, or whatever, I go back to that feeling. I go back to that idea of the fact that we really had partaken in an act of resistance doing that book in that way. And then once we started talking about it and writing about it, and we started saying out loud, we weren't prepared. Why weren't we prepared? Whose job is it to prepare us? Whether it was our own job or our advisor's job or the program's job or the world's job was not what we were criticizing. We were criticizing this unpreparedness. That very much feels like an act of resistance. The idea that, because what we felt like was, here, we need to teach you how to, okay, do the research. We need to teach you how to be a university professor. Okay, learn how to do it. But you got to publish.
Yeah.
And saying, no, wait a second. I'm going to push back on that. Seemed like a really important act of resistance.
You know, you're reminding me of actually the last chapter of our book, which is slightly different than most of them. Actually, is it? Yes. And it's by a couple, this probably isn't going to help, but it's by a couple of scholars who, at the time they wrote it, were graduate students, doctoral students in South Africa, chapter 16. And they're basically talking about creating their own infrastructure to, if you saw that chapter, you know, to support each other in a kind of, I don't think that they framed it so much as resistance, but it was very explicit that for some of them, they were really struggling with the role of their advisor or supervisor, and that it was only because they felt it was only because of this collaboration with each other and really kind of supporting each other through the process that they were able to mediate the comments from their advisors, which can, you know, often be difficult to take, and really support each other through even just in setting up writing accountability structures. But I think the closer connection to what you're talking about is really resisting the role of a student, resisting being put in this role of a supplicant, that, you know, we're waiting for you to give us the resources. We're going to create the resources that we need ourselves, which, I mean, as somebody who supervised for a long time, for 17 or more years, I really admire that, because I think that institutionally that students are often, and many doctoral students and graduate students are older. They're not 23 years old. They've been in the world. They've been grown-ups. And so the institution forces you back in this role of kind of not knowing anything, but to take that ownership of what you, if you know it, you can figure it out. You know, I think that's it's very exciting. I assume it feels, from what you're saying, that it feels empowering for yourselves, which is, as we know, the only way you can actually be empowered, right?
It was empowering, wasn't it, Fernanda?
Yeah, it was.
It was
I'm very proud of our book.
Yeah. And really, even though none of us has the intention to be like a scholar of research, you know, to be a methodology specialist, or everyone's doing research in really different ways, and nobody's going in that direction right now. Maybe Sir Laney is a little bit. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter, because that was the question that was so involving for us, all of us. When we said that, hey, how about method? How about methodology? We all were able to kind of go, oh, yeah, there was some part where I struggled.
Sure.
And getting into it I had trouble because I researched private schools, and I kept getting the door slammed in my face. And I had to figure out how to do that without getting the door slammed in my face. And I had to figure out how to do it, because I'm an American. I don't feel 100% right about studying Brazilian public schools and being the white woman that comes in and tells I don't feel comfortable with that. The private school I'm okay with for reasons. But I couldn't get anybody to open the door. And so I dealt a lot with that particular part. Other people dealt with the fights that they had with their main authors, you know, the theorists that they're dealing with, and how the instruments that you have. People talked about the instruments, and for all of us, it felt very much like that we really owned what went into that book. I think for some of us more so than the thesis or the dissertation. I think.
Yeah. So you want to venture? Are you there?
Hello,
Theresa. Did you want to?
I'm not. Can you hear me? I'm only catching at this stage sort of odd phrases. Can you hear me?
Oh, we hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Theresa,
the challenge of you're talking about taking control over your own production, you know, whoever you are, is a really powerful thing, isn't it? There's a big challenge for all of us about where we decide to put our energies and what we decide to try and take control over. I mean, now you've successfully produced that book, edited that book. At the same time, you're talking about how competitive it is to get jobs, you know, as academics. So I'm wondering what the success of that book kind of makes you feel about how you want to engage with, you know, the politics of writing for publication generally. Whether it's just something that's big on your agenda and you're trying to work out. I mean, obviously we faced those issues. We've published a lot now, but we hadn't published a lot, obviously, when we started. And we made compromises so that, you know, you think we really want to tell this part of the story, if you like, this kind of angle on what's going on. Which journal might be willing to listen to it? Are there specific things we need to do to get them to listen to it? So you do make compromises depending on what you're aiming to do. I don't think we were driven by, we want to be in a big journal, or, you know, actually wanted, as you say, get the ideas out there. But I'm wondering what your experience sort of, you know, where's it taking you in terms of your next steps or how you feel about being scholars and publishing, given the kind of the competitive nature of academia and of publishing.
Fernanda, your turn.
Well, I think I speak for me and for Chris that both of us, we actually love this world. We love to do research and to see something that we did it out there is amazing.
Yeah.
And I think we share this interest. I think I know I want this to teach in a higher education with this group of people that want to be teachers, that want to go out there and do something different. And for that, to know how to do that, we have to research, and to publish is something that comes with it.
I mean, the example of one of the chapters in our book is about a Colombian-based journal. I don't know if you saw that one. And clearly what they're doing there, they made compromises, but they were very keen to engage in the kind of the issues, the knowledge they wanted to make, which actually wasn't being recognized by mainstream ELT. So, there's an example of decisions made there. And we know about scholars in other parts. So, when we think of some of the people, the younger scholars in Chile, who are very keen to work through Spanish and English and mixing languages in spaces, in publications, to engage with the people they want to engage with. So I guess what I'm thinking is there are people who are trying to do things differently because it's important to them for what they're, what they're trying to do. So we do have this kind of big machinery thing going on, but people are doing all sorts of interesting things as well.
And in my case, I know that I'm not at the moment to be able to publish now because I'm exactly in the middle of my doctorate. And so I'm just, I was going to collect data this semester. So data collection is going to get, I can't even imagine doing data collection next semester when principals are so concerned with putting their schools back together,
That's
but anyway, I don't know. Either I start writing about a pandemic, or I wait long enough that I'm not writing about a pandemic. But the education of elites, as I've funneled even more since my master's, is a very restricted, specific, special area. And for me, I think that helps, because this whole idea of who wants to read what I have to say, who's gonna, when I was trying to talk about immersion education, it was so big, and it was really hard for me to figure out how to say something. And I still think, I lived 28 years outside of Brazil. I still think very much like a North American, and very much North American mindset about how we think about education, etc. So I couldn't talk to Brazilian academics about bilingual education. It didn't work. It didn't work for me. But this does. What I'm doing now functions for me. And I think part of it is that it's a really little, almost niche market. Very small number of people who are really invested in studying about the education of elites. So for me, that's kind of how I answer that question, is community and the community of scholars, which community of scholars that I want to get involved in,
And there may
and I think that as we go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, and there may be multiple communities, and I think this is one thing that for some people develops over time.
Yes.
The immediate academic community that you're engaging with as a student, as you enter a field, learn who's in there, start to read people's work, start to see who's kind of, making a lot of contributions, and then, whose work you might want to take issue with, and whether you feel that you have the rights to do that, and whether, the knowledge is based, like a lot of that knowledge that I'm familiar with about elite education is based in the US, but you know, there's probably other work going on, because of one of the things that English blinders does is sort of limit a lot of North American scholars, certainly, to only knowing the research from our culture context and or only in English, you know, UK. So, I mean, doing that work when you're living in another culture and when you have access through the language to the scholarship in 2 languages is actually really exciting, because, you know, it gives you kind of multiplicity of entry points.
We have kind of come to the end of our time, and I would like to know if we maybe have a few minutes to see if anyone who's watching would like to ask something. Would that be okay?
You might, I don't know.
Yes,
I can't see anyone who's watching. Are you able to see, Chris?
I have a, they can talk to me.
I see. Okay.
Oh, you're the host.
I'm the host, so they can talk to me and I can read the question. So we have time for a question, maybe 2, if whoever's watching would like to ask anything to either of our scholars. What I can't say is how many people are watching. I know there are people watching, but I don't know how many people are watching.
Interesting.
No, it's an interesting platform that I have here in front of me.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Did you
I
have
think
a
we're
final,
exhausted.
that's right. Did you have a final question for us?
You know, I really don't. I think that we kind of covered most of what we wanted to talk about, and we really appreciate your time. Of course, Telos Editora is so glad to have been able to have you here, and we're thrilled to have your book in the collection.
Super.
Because I think it's really pertinent to our Brazilian academic audience.
That's great.
And
so they'll be distributing the book, and the book will be distributed as published in English, right? This is not involving translation.
No. Yeah. This project doesn't involve any translation. Translation is possible, but that's a different. For one thing, it would be a different negotiation with the original publisher.
No, that's what I thought. We did have one of our articles translated into Brazilian Portuguese and included in a book edited by Raquel Fiad at Unicamp, that came out a couple of years ago on literacy. So we do have at least one publication, to my knowledge, of ours has been translated into Brazilian Portuguese.
I think in one of the emails at the very beginning of saying deciding if we were going to do this or not, one of you mentioned the other book, how to get published, how to publish, how to.
It's called A Scholar's Guide to Getting Published in English.
I think this is an interesting possibility. We could maybe further that discussion a little bit, because I think that sounds like something that Brazilians would be quite interested in.
Yeah, that's another Multilingual Matters book.
And we're kind of a translating team. Okay. Which is nice, because we've got 2 native speakers, and so we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We got a question.
Okay.
It's Ana Cortez Lagos says, I have a question about the challenges of collaborations across borders, which she knows that you all have done.
We've done that for almost 17 years now. So yeah, Theresa, do you want to start on that one?
Well, obviously the practical, I mean, take like anything that's slightly different requires a lot more time, a lot more energy. So for parts of our collaboration, we've been in the same place, but for a lot of the time, one of us has been in the UK, one has been in the US, but also our main sites were 4 other countries: Hungary, Slovakia, Spain, and Portugal. So we had to invest huge amounts of time just at the practical level of being in the same places to do research. So I'm not quite sure what kind of question they're actually thinking of. Are they thinking about us and how we've managed to keep it going?
Well, she has
a follow-up. Okay.
There's kind of a follow-up. She says, I'm beginning to do work about that. I'm interested in what happens with this cross-language, cross-border dynamics when you engage in direct collaborations.
Well, I mean,
so in your case,
Theresa,
cross-linguistic.
Well, it's slightly, there were some interesting cross-linguistic differences, but obviously, you know, varietal differences. But I mean, I worked for 3 years in England at the Open University, and so that was how we began our collaboration and got started. And so we did have a lot of initial data collection that we were doing while we were both based in the UK. And then I came back to the US and I got my job at Rochester. So we've had time change differences, which have been both, I think, useful and difficult. But I mean, like when we've been working on a real deadline, I might have sent Theresa some text or version of a manuscript when I went to bed, and she'd get it 5 hours ahead. So she'd have time to start working on it and send me something, or she'd finish working on something at night and send it, you know, so that there are ways that time change could actually be beneficial. But before Skype and Zoom, it was challenging because we had phone calls and emails. We've had, I think, some challenges in just like, you know, we have a very large database of all of the interviews and texts that interviews we've done, texts we've collected, all of that. And I don't think I have complete access to the most recent version of that because it was on the server in England. But, you know, we've managed that stuff. I think there's also just the same challenges everybody has, which is time and being in different institutions that have different types of priorities, different requirements of our jobs. You know, I've got like 12 or more doctoral students at a time to be working with. Theresa's on a longer year contract than I am. You know, there's just differences. So, but I mean, those could be the same if you were in the same institution to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Theresa, did you want to add? Can you? I'm not sure if your internet is.
And go on, Chris. What were you saying?
I was just going to say, I think that the initial connection, the face-to-face connection that happens with another person, must be maybe not face-to-face, but some sort of something that brings you together. Must be really strong to be able to sustain the distance of this kind of a collaboration. You know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and people write about, you know, co-presencing in ethnography, you know, why we can do like we can do virtual interviews, observations or whatever, but the physical presencing has been written about quite a lot just as a research method. But obviously, as you say, as researchers, what do you get by being co-present? And I think there's, you know, as you say, that's really important, both between us and then between all our different participants in different parts of the world. But of course, when we came together, we weren't. We had similar research interests outside of the project we were then building. So we were both interested in academic writing, issues of equity, etc., in higher education. So the kind of ideological interests were shared from the beginning, which I think probably helps. Yeah. And then obviously, as you're forging ideas, then you're working through all work, you know, all intellectual work. You work hard at, don't you, to try and articulate what you mean, what the differences are, where you're going, what you're going to try and forge together, etc. But I think we shared an ideology, if you like. Which then made everything easier. Yeah,
a collaboration of this sort is kind of like any kind of a collaboration. You gotta have things in commons. You're going to have language and communicative problems. Distance and factors like communication, email, etc. is going to be a bigger factor or less depending upon how well connected you are, for whatever reason that is. The research, the line, or whatever it is.
I mean, I think one of the things that I've happened to be sharing an office as we developed our collaboration, that was just coincidence. But I think, I mean, you know, when you're working in the same place, you know, you can go for a walk together and talk about your ideas. You can have a meal together. You're in Britain, you have a cup of tea together. I mean, and you know, it's sort of when you're setting up a time to Zoom or whatever, you're always sort of aware of everything else that's waiting for you. And it doesn't have that same, also you don't tend to do it as frequently. So I think that feels like something that that I've missed. But you know, we've often met up for conferences. We'll intentionally go to the same conference so that we can meet up. We might spend some extra days together before or after to do work or you know, do planning. So, you know, it's evolved. I mean, we certainly wouldn't romanticize it. I mean, there have been plenty of difficult moments as you say, it's like any relationship. I think we're both pretty stubborn. So I think that, you know, neither one of us wanted ever to like admit defeat, or at least I didn't. If there were moments that you just felt like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And then you wake up the next day and you figure, well, you know, I'm going to do it. So, I mean, I've learned an enormous amount from working with Theresa. I mean, I feel like she's probably not going to like this little emotional side of things, but I mean, I just feel like for me, it's been one of the biggest gift of my career was to develop this collaboration with someone who not only shares my political, ideological commitments, but intellectual commitments. I mean, I think we're both really committed to doing quality work, and that may take longer. You may get less out of it. We may have fewer. I mean, at this point, we have a lot of publications, but there were times when we felt like, oh, we haven't published anything for a couple of years, but we're working all the time, you know.
I mean, that is a challenge of pressure and external pressure. It's a bit like, well, anyway, people would say, are you still working on that project? As if we should have finished. Haven't you done that yet? You know?
Yeah.
So, well, we're still trying to work it out. We're still thinking about it. And you know, in relative terms, our publications were quite slow. You know, people say, well, you could have had, half a dozen out by now. So, I mean, that's resisting that pressure to move faster than you actually should, it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult, I think, in academia.
Yeah. And we didn't set out to do longitudinal work. It evolved over time. So I guess we're still doing it. But so that's a great question, though, Anna. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for being here this afternoon with us. It was great. I learned a lot, and I feel kind of academically invigorated, which has not been happening. Some of my books might be more interesting now. And I'm going to end the broadcast, and if you guys can just stay on the line for a second. All right?
Sure.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.